Sister Margaret wiped the flour from her hands and looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was already 3 in the afternoon, and she still had 24 cookies to bake before tonight's charity event. At 78 years old, she moved a bit slower than she used to, but her determination never wavered. The small kitchen at St. Catherine's Convent smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. Sister Margaret had been living here for the past 60 years, ever since she took her vows as a young woman. The other nuns often joked that she must have memorized every crack in these old walls by now. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck in the summer heat, and exactly how long it took for the ancient oven to preheat. Her days followed a simple rhythm: morning prayers at dawn, breakfast in the communal dining room, then off to tend the garden or help at the soup kitchen downtown. Sister Margaret never complained about the routine. In fact, she found peace in it. There was something beautiful about knowing exactly what each day would bring, but today was different. Today, she had volunteered to help at the annual charity gala being held at the Riverside Concert Hall. It was one of the biggest fundraising events of the year, with all the money going to homeless shelters across the city. Sister Margaret had been serving at these shelters for decades, ladling soup and offering kind words to people who had nowhere else to go. When she heard about the gala, she immediately offered to bake cookies and help serve refreshments. She pulled the last batch of chocolate chip cookies from the oven and set them on the cooling rack. The recipe was one she had perfected over the years, with just a hint of sea salt that made people close their eyes in delight after the first bite. Sister Margaret believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it with love and care, even something as simple as baking cookies. As the sun began to set, she carefully packed the cookies into containers and changed into a fresh habit. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman with silver hair tucked neatly beneath her veil, gentle blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and hands that bore the marks of a lifetime of hard work. She looked like exactly what she was, a humble nun who had dedicated her life to serving others. The bus ride to Riverside Concert Hall took 40 minutes. Sister Margaret sat by the window watching the city pass by. Young couples walked hand in hand down the sidewalks. Children chased each other through the park. Life moved fast out here, so different from the quiet pace of the convent. She didn't mind, though. She had made her choice long ago, and she had never regretted it. When the concert hall came into view, Sister Margaret felt her breath catch slightly. It was magnificent, with tall marble columns and golden lights that made it look like a palace. She had walked past this building hundreds of times but had never been inside. Tonight would be her first time stepping through those grand doors. Inside, the concert hall was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting rainbow sparkles across the polished floors. The walls were covered in rich velvet curtains, and everywhere she looked, she saw wealth and elegance. People in expensive suits and glittering dresses were already starting to arrive, their laughter echoing through the spacious lobby. Sister Margaret made her way to the service entrance carrying her containers of cookies. A staff member directed her to the kitchen area behind the main hall, where other volunteers were already busy preparing refreshments. No one paid much attention to the elderly nun in her simple black habit. She was just part of the background, there to serve, not to be noticed. She found her station near the refreshment table and began arranging her cookies on silver platters. The other volunteers chatted among themselves, talking about their jobs, their families, their weekend plans. Sister Margaret listened and smiled but didn't say much. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to serve was simply to be present and do your work quietly. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the stage at the center of the hall. Right in the middle, bathed in a soft spotlight, sat the most beautiful grand piano she had ever seen. It was black and polished to such perfection that it seemed to glow. The lid was open, revealing the strings inside, ready to sing. Something stirred in Sister Margaret's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in many, many years. She found herself staring at the piano, unable to look away. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, moving in patterns that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Beautiful, isn't it?" A young woman in a catering uniform had appeared beside her. "They say it's worth more than a house. Can you imagine?" Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, it's quite remarkable. Do you play?" the young woman asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. Sister Margaret's hands stilled. "I did once," she said softly. A very long time ago. The young woman smiled and moved on to help with the wine glasses. Sister Margaret turned back to her cookies, but her eyes kept drifting to that piano. Memories she had carefully tucked away began to surface, like old photographs discovered in a forgotten drawer. She remembered the feel of keys beneath her fingers, the way music could fill a room and change the very air people breathed. She remembered practice sessions that lasted until her fingers ached, the thrill of performance, the applause that felt like thunder. But she also remembered the pain that had driven her away from all of it, the grief that had made her seek refuge in the quiet life of service. Sister Margaret shook her head gently, pushing those memories back where they belonged. That was another lifetime ago. Another person. That girl with dreams of concert halls and standing ovations had disappeared the day she took her vows and became Sister Margaret. And she had been content with that choice. More than content. She had found purpose and peace in serving others. The guests began to fill the main hall, their voices growing louder as champagne was poured and conversations flowed. Sister Margaret picked up a tray of cookies and moved through the crowd, offering them with a warm smile. Most people took a cookie without really looking at her. A few thanked her politely. One elderly gentleman complimented her baking, and his genuine kindness made her whole evening feel worthwhile. She moved like a shadow through the glittering crowd, invisible in her simplicity. The women wore dresses that probably cost more than the convent spent on food in a month. The men wore watches that gleamed with gold and diamonds. This was a different world from hers, but Sister Margaret felt no envy. She had chosen a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in money. As 8 o'clock approached, the guests began taking their seats. The lights dimmed slightly and an excited murmur filled the hall. Everyone was eager to hear tonight's featured performer, a famous pianist who was flying in from New York just for this event. The program note said he had performed at Carnegie Hall and had won international competitions. The tickets for this gala had sold out within hours. Sister Margaret cleared some empty glasses from a table near the stage entrance and prepared to return to the kitchen. But before she left, she allowed herself one more glance at that beautiful piano, gleaming under the spotlight, waiting for skilled hands to bring it to life. She had no idea that in less than an hour everything would change. The evening she thought would be just another night of quiet service was about to become something she would never forget. And that piano, the one she couldn't stop looking at, would soon become the instrument of a transformation that would leave everyone in that hall absolutely speechless. The clock on the wall read 7:15. Sister Margaret was arranging fresh napkins on the refreshment table when she noticed the change in atmosphere. The relaxed chatter among the event staff had suddenly become urgent whispers. Something was wrong. She glanced toward the coordinator's office and saw Victoria pacing back and forth, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. Even from a distance, Sister Margaret could see the tension in the woman's shoulders, the way her free hand kept gesturing frantically as she spoke. "What do you mean the flight is delayed?" Victoria's voice carried across the hallway, louder than she probably intended. "How long?" No, that's not acceptable. The performance starts in 45 minutes. Sister Margaret's heart sank. She had overheard enough conversations throughout the evening to know that tonight's featured performer was flying in from New York, a famous pianist whose name people spoke with reverence. The entire event had been built around his performance. Another staff member hurried past, almost bumping into Sister Margaret. "Excuse me, sister," the young woman said breathlessly, then continued toward the office where Victoria was still on the phone. Sister Margaret moved closer, not wanting to intrude but unable to help her concern. Through the open doorway, she could see Victoria sink into her chair, her face pale. "Cancelled? The entire flight is cancelled?" Victoria's voice had gone from angry to desperate. "But surely there's another flight." "What about a private plane?" A pause. "I understand. Thank you for trying." The phone call ended and Victoria sat motionless for a moment, staring at nothing. Then she picked up her phone again and started dialing with shaking fingers. Robert, the tall man in the navy suit who Sister Margaret had seen earlier, appeared in the doorway. "Please tell me that wasn't what I think it was." Victoria looked up at him and Sister Margaret could see actual fear in her eyes. The storm over Chicago grounded everything. "He's stuck there. He's not coming. Can we postpone?" Robert asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Postpone?" Victoria let out a laugh that held no humor. Robert, there are 300 people arriving right now. They've paid $200 a ticket. Senator Williams is here. The mayor is here. Half the city council is here. We have photographers from 3 newspapers and a local TV crew. Then we find another pianist, Robert said, but he didn't sound confident. At 7:30 on a Friday night? Who exactly do you suggest? Victoria was already scrolling through her phone contacts, her fingers moving frantically across the screen. Sister Margaret watched as Victoria made call after call. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Hope, then disappointment, then desperation. Every pianist in the city seemed to be either out of town, already committed to other performances, or simply unavailable on such short notice. In the main hall, the guests were starting to arrive in larger numbers. Sister Margaret returned to her post, offering cookies and coffee with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She could hear the excited conversations, people looking forward to the performance. They had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. I heard he played at Lincoln Center last month. One woman in a glittering gold dress said to her companion. Sold out in hours. I've been looking forward to this for weeks, her friend replied. I even bought a new dress. Sister Margaret felt the weight of their expectations like a physical thing. These people had come here ready to be moved, to experience something beautiful, and more importantly, they had come to support the homeless shelters. The thought of disappointing them, of the shelters losing this crucial funding, made her chest ache. She made her way back toward the office, where the situation seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. Victoria was on her 5th or 6th call and her professional composure was cracking. Please, Lawrence, I'm begging you. I know it's your anniversary dinner, but this is an emergency. A pause. I understand. I'm sorry to have bothered you. Congratulations again. She hung up and dropped her phone on the desk as if it had burned her. Robert stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. 2 other committee members had joined them now, a nervous-looking man with glasses and the woman Sister Margaret had seen earlier wearing all the diamonds. What about recorded music? The nervous man suggested weakly. Recorded music? The diamond woman's voice dripped with disdain. Do you have any idea how that would look? We advertised a live performance by an internationally renowned pianist. We can't just play a CD and call it a night. Then what do you suggest, Helen? Victoria snapped, her patience clearly exhausted. Because I'm out of ideas. Helen, the diamond woman, shook her head. We need to make an announcement. Apologize, offer refunds, and hope we don't end up in the papers for all the wrong reasons. The shelters, Victoria said quietly. They're counting on this money. We promised them. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Sister Margaret stood in the hallway, her hands clasped together, feeling utterly helpless. She had spent years working in those shelters, had seen the desperate need firsthand. Just last week, she'd held a young mother who was crying because there wasn't enough room at any shelter in the city. The woman and her 2 children had spent the night in her car. This fundraiser was supposed to change that. The money raised tonight was going to help expand shelter capacity, provide more meals, offer more services. It was vital. It was necessary. And now it was all falling apart. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and prayed, not for a miracle exactly, but for guidance, for wisdom, for some way to help these people who were trying so hard to do good in the world. When she opened her eyes, she found herself looking at the stage again, at that beautiful piano sitting in the spotlight. Her fingers tingled with a familiar sensation, muscle memory from a lifetime ago stirring after decades of sleep. She thought about David, her fiancé who had died so long ago. He had always told her that her gift wasn't just for her own enjoyment. You play like you're talking to God, he used to say. That's meant to be shared, Margaret. That's meant to help people. For 53 years, she had kept that gift locked away, buried under layers of grief and devotion to a different kind of service. But maybe, just maybe, this was the moment it was meant to resurface. The conversation in the office had grown more heated. Victoria was fighting back tears. Robert was suggesting they simply cancel the entire event. Helen was worried about the political fallout. The nervous man was frantically calculating refund amounts on his phone. Sister Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward to the doorway. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. Excuse me. No one heard her. They were too caught up in their crisis, their voices talking over each other. Excuse me, she said again, a little louder this time. Victoria looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Sister, I'm sorry, but we're dealing with an emergency right now. If you need something, perhaps— I don't need anything, Sister Margaret interrupted gently. But I think perhaps I can help. Robert turned to look at her, confusion evident on his face. Help how? Sister Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The words felt strange coming out, like speaking a language she hadn't used in half a century. I could play the piano, if you need someone. The office went completely silent. 4 pairs of eyes stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Helen recovered first, and to Sister Margaret's surprise, she laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but with the kind of dismissiveness that comes from thinking you've heard something absurd. That's very sweet of you, sister, but this isn't a church service. These people are expecting professional quality performance. I understand that, Sister Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Victoria stood up, attempting to be diplomatic. Sister Margaret, we truly appreciate the offer. But performing at this level requires years of advanced training and professional experience. It's not something just anyone can do. I know, Sister Margaret said simply. Robert stepped forward, his tone gentler but still patronizing. Have you ever performed in front of a large audience before? Yes, Sister Margaret replied. A long time ago. Where? At your convent? Helen asked, unable to hide her skepticism. Sister Margaret hesitated. She had spent so long keeping her past buried, had worked so hard to leave Margaret Chen behind and become Sister Margaret. Opening that door felt dangerous, like inviting old pain back into her carefully ordered life. But in the main hall, 300 people were gathering, expecting magic. And in shelters across the city, people were sleeping on cold floors, going hungry, losing hope. If her gift could help them, didn't she have an obligation to try? Not at the convent, she said quietly. Before I took my vows, I studied piano. I performed professionally. Victoria exchanged a glance with Robert. When was this? 53 years ago. The 4 committee members stared at her. Then Robert shook his head. Sister, with all due respect, you can't just pick up a piano after 50 years and perform at a concert hall level. That's not how it works. Even if you were good back then, which I'm sure you were, the skill deteriorates. The technique fades. I understand your concern, Sister Margaret said. Her hands were trembling now, but she kept them hidden in the folds of her habit. I'm only offering because I know how important this is. For the shelters, for the people who need help. Helen's expression had softened slightly, but she still looked doubtful. It's kind of you to offer, truly. But this isn't about effort or good intentions. These guests are sophisticated. They know good music from bad. If someone gets up there and struggles through a simple piece, it will be worse than nothing at all. Victoria sank back into her chair, looking utterly defeated. We're going to have to make an announcement. There's no other choice. Sister Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, that place where she had kept all her old dreams locked away. She thought about David again, about the life they had planned together, about all the concerts she never gave, all the music she never shared, about the gift that had been sleeping inside her all these years waiting. I could play Rachmaninoff, she heard herself say. The Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement. That's what was on tonight's program, wasn't it? The room went silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavier, more uncertain. Robert stared at her. That's one of the most difficult pieces in the entire classical repertoire. I know, Sister Margaret said. You're saying you can play that? After 53 years? Sister Margaret met his eyes. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, something old and familiar clicking back into place. I'm saying I'd like to try. The minutes crawled by like hours. Sister Margaret stood near the kitchen entrance, wringing the dishcloth in her hands without even realizing it. Through the doorway, she could see the coordinator pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice growing more desperate with each call. Please, I'm begging you. We have 300 people waiting. The shelters are counting on this money. A pause. I understand. Thank you anyway. Another call ended in disappointment. Sister Margaret's heart sank deeper with each rejection. She had spent countless hours at those shelters, had held the hands of mothers who couldn't feed their children, had listened to elderly men talk about sleeping on cold sidewalks. This event was supposed to help them. The thought of it failing felt like a weight pressing on her chest. She set down the dishcloth and smoothed her habit with nervous hands. The words she had spoken earlier still echoed in her mind. Perhaps I could help. They had dismissed her so quickly, so completely. And why wouldn't they? She was just an old nun who spent her days in a garden and a soup kitchen. What business did she have even thinking about that magnificent piano on stage? But something inside her wouldn't let go. It was like a small voice, persistent and gentle, reminding her that gifts were meant to be used, especially when they could help others. She had buried her talent for so long, had convinced herself it was the right thing to do, but maybe, just maybe, tonight was different. In the main hall, the audience was getting restless. Sister Margaret could hear the rising volume of conversation, the impatient shuffling of feet. Someone laughed loudly. Glasses clinked. These people had paid good money and dressed in their finest clothes. They had come expecting something special, and instead they were getting chaos and confusion. The coordinator, whose name tag read Victoria, hung up her phone and leaned against the wall. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. Two other committee members approached her, a middle-aged man in a navy suit and a woman wearing so many diamonds they caught the light with every movement. "We need to make a decision," the man said. "We can't keep them waiting much longer." "I know, Robert, I know," Victoria replied, rubbing her temples. "But what do you want me to do? Have someone read poetry? Play recorded music? These people came for a live performance." The woman with the diamonds shook her head. "This is a nightmare. Do you know how hard I worked to get Senator Williams to attend? His wife is already complaining about the wait." Sister Margaret took a deep breath and stepped out of the kitchen. Her legs felt shaky, but she kept walking toward the group. Victoria saw her coming and something flickered across her face. Annoyance, maybe. Or just the stress of someone who didn't have time for one more problem. "Sister, if you need something, perhaps one of the other volunteers can help you," Victoria said, trying to sound polite but clearly wanting to get back to her crisis. "I don't need anything," Sister Margaret said quietly. "But you do. You need a pianist." The three committee members stared at her. Robert, the man in the navy suit, actually groaned. "Not this again." "Sister, we appreciate the offer, we really do," Victoria said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "But this isn't a church recital. These people paid $200 a ticket. They're expecting professional quality entertainment." "I understand that," Sister Margaret said. She could feel her heart hammering, but she kept her voice steady. "I wouldn't offer if I didn't think I could help." The woman with the diamonds let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think you can perform at a concert hall level? Have you ever even been to a professional performance?" The question stung, but Sister Margaret didn't let it show. "Yes, many times. Playing or watching?" Robert asked, his tone making it clear he already knew the answer. "Both," Sister Margaret said simply. There was a moment of awkward silence. The three committee members exchanged glances that said everything. They thought she was confused, maybe a little senile. A sweet old nun who didn't understand the difference between playing hymns at Sunday Mass and performing Rachmaninoff for a paying audience. "Look, sister," Victoria said, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm sure you play beautifully for your congregation. But what we need tonight is something very different. It requires years of professional training, technical precision, and stage experience. No offense, but you're just not equipped for this." Sister Margaret nodded slowly. The dismissal was clear. She should go back to the kitchen, back to washing dishes and staying invisible. That was her role here. That was her life. But then a young voice cut through the tension. "Maybe you should let her try." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was the sound technician, a skinny kid with messy hair and nervous energy. He had been working on the stage all evening, adjusting microphones and checking speakers, barely noticed by anyone. "Excuse me?" Victoria said, her eyebrows raised. The young man whose name tag identified him as Kevin stepped closer. "I'm just saying maybe she can actually play."
Have you asked her what pieces she knows?
"What her background is." Robert crossed his arms. "Kevin, stick to the sound equipment. We're trying to handle a serious situation here." "I know, I'm sorry, but..." Kevin looked at Sister Margaret, then back at Victoria. "What if she's telling the truth? What do we have to lose by letting her sit at the piano for 2 minutes? If she can't play, we make an announcement and refund tickets. That's what we're about to do anyway." The woman with the diamonds shook her head. "This is ridiculous. We'd be making fools of ourselves." But Victoria was looking at Sister Margaret differently now, really looking at her for the first time. "Sister, what exactly is your experience with piano?" Sister Margaret hesitated. She had spent so many years keeping this part of herself locked away. The words felt strange coming out after all this time. I trained at a music conservatory. I performed professionally before I took my vows. When was this? Victoria asked. A long time ago. 53 years. Robert threw up his hands. 53 years. That settles it. Even if she was good back then, you can't just pick up a piano after 5 decades and perform at a concert level. That's not how it works. Actually, Kevin said quietly, if she was really good, the muscle memory doesn't completely disappear. My grandmother was a violinist. She didn't play for 30 years after she had a stroke, but when she finally picked up the violin again, it came back. Not perfectly, but enough that you could tell she had been exceptional once. Victoria was still watching Sister Margaret. The hall had grown noticeably louder now. Someone was shouting for a refund. Time was running out. What would you play? She asked. Whatever you need, Sister Margaret said. I know the program said Rachmaninoff. I can play that if you'd like. The Piano Concerto No. 2? Yes, the first movement. The woman with the diamonds laughed again, but there was less certainty in it now. That's one of the hardest pieces in the classical repertoire. You expect us to believe an old nun can play that? Sister Margaret met her eyes without flinching. I don't expect you to believe anything, but I'm offering to try. For the shelters, for all those people who need help. Another long moment passed. In the main hall, someone started a slow clap, sarcastic and impatient. Others joined in. The sound grew louder, a wave of frustration building toward something ugly. Victoria closed her eyes, weighing an impossible decision. When she opened them again, she looked exhausted but resigned. Okay, fine, sister, you can play. One piece. But I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think this is going to work. When it doesn't, I'll have to stop you and apologize to the audience. Do you understand? I understand, Sister Margaret said. And you're sure about this? You're not going to get up there and freeze? I'm sure. Victoria turned to Kevin. Get her some water. Make sure the bench is adjusted correctly. Then to Robert and the Diamond Woman, let's prepare an apology statement just in case. As they walked away, their doubt hung in the air like heavy perfume. Sister Margaret could hear their whispers. This is going to be a complete disaster. I can't watch. I'm going to wait in the office, and poor woman. She has no idea how badly this is going to go. Kevin returned with water and a kind smile. Don't listen to them, he said. I believe you. Sister Margaret took the water with trembling hands. Thank you, dear. That means more than you know. Are you nervous? She thought about it for a moment. Terrified, but not about playing. I'm terrified of letting people down, of failing those shelters. Then don't think about the audience, Kevin said. Just play. For yourself. For the music. Sister Margaret finished the water and handed back the glass. Through the doorway, she could see the stage, the spotlight, the piano waiting. Victoria was speaking with the MC now, preparing him for the announcement. In moments, they would call her name. A name most of these people would forget within minutes. But the music wouldn't be forgotten. If she could just get her hands on those keys, if the gift was still there after all these years of silence, the music would speak louder than any doubt or dismissal ever could. It's time, Kevin said gently. Sister Margaret straightened her habit and walked toward the stage entrance. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her steps were steady. Behind her, she heard someone say, I give it 30 seconds before this falls apart completely. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking, kept praying, kept believing that sometimes the smallest and most overlooked among us carry the biggest surprises. And tonight, whether anyone was ready for it or not, Sister Margaret was about to remind 300 people never to judge a book by its cover. The MC's voice crackled through the speakers, cutting through the restless murmur of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Due to circumstances beyond our control, tonight's scheduled performer is unable to join us. A wave of disappointed groans rolled through the audience. Someone shouted, Are you kidding me? Another voice called out, I want my money back. Sister Margaret stood in the wings, hidden by the heavy velvet curtain. Her hands were clasped together, but not in prayer this time. She was stretching her fingers, feeling the joints move, testing the flexibility that age had stolen bit by bit over the decades. They were stiffer than they used to be. The arthritis that sometimes made it hard to open jar lids wasn't going to make this any easier. The MC continued, his voice uncertain. However, we have a volunteer who has graciously offered to perform for us tonight. Please welcome Sister Margaret." The applause that followed was polite but confused. Sister Margaret could hear the whispers starting immediately, a rushing sound like wind through trees. She took one step forward, then another. The stage lights were brighter than she remembered, hot and blinding. For a moment she couldn't see anything beyond the glare. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them, 300 people in their elegant clothes, their faces showing everything from curiosity to irritation to outright skepticism. A woman in the third row leaned over to whisper to her companion, not even bothering to hide her smirk. A man near the back was already reaching for his phone, probably to check how soon he could leave. Sister Margaret walked slowly across the stage. Each step felt like it took forever. Her simple black habit stood in stark contrast to the grandeur around her. The stage that had been built for glamour and spectacle now held a 78-year-old nun who looked like she should be serving tea at a church social, not performing at a charity gala. Someone in the audience actually laughed. It wasn't loud, but in the near silence of the hall it carried. Others joined in with nervous giggles. They weren't trying to be mean, not really. They just didn't understand what they were seeing. It looked absurd. An elderly nun approaching a concert grand piano like she belonged there. Sister Margaret reached the piano bench and stood beside it for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the polished surface of the instrument. The wood was cool and smooth under her palm. She could feel the vibrations of potential within it, waiting to be released. In the wings, Victoria stood with her hands covering her face, unable to watch what she was certain would be a humiliating disaster. Robert had already left to prepare the refund paperwork. The woman with the diamonds was filming on her phone, probably planning to share the catastrophe with her friends later. Only Kevin, the young sound technician, watched with hope in his eyes. Sister Margaret sat down on the bench and took a moment to adjust it. Too high at first, then she lowered it slightly. The audience was growing impatient again. More whispers. More barely suppressed laughter. A man in the front row checked his watch with exaggerated obviousness. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't press down yet. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not the pain, not the loss, not the grief that had driven her away. Just the music. Pure and simple. The way it had felt when she was young and the whole world was open before her. The way each note was a prayer, each phrase a conversation with something greater than herself. Her fingers found their positions. The opening chord of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 formed under her hands. She took one breath, then another, and then she played. The first notes rang out across the concert hall and everything changed. It wasn't tentative or shaky. It wasn't the sound of someone who hadn't played in 53 years. It was powerful and sure. Each note struck with perfect clarity and purpose. The famous opening chords, heavy and dramatic, filled the space like a thunderstorm rolling in. The laughter stopped instantly. The whispers died. 300 people froze in their seats as if someone had pressed pause on the entire room. Sister Margaret's hands moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. Her fingers flew through the complex passages, never hesitating, never stumbling. The muscle memory that Robert had said wouldn't be there was there. It had been sleeping, waiting, and now it was wide awake. But it wasn't just technical skill. Anyone trained enough could hit the right notes. What poured out of that piano was something deeper. It was emotion-given sound. Every note carried the weight of a life lived, of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, of faith found in the darkest moments. The melody soared and dove, climbed and fell. Sister Margaret swayed slightly with the music, her body remembering the movement, the way to let the sound flow through her instead of forcing it. Her eyes remained closed, and on her weathered face was an expression of pure peace. She wasn't in the concert hall anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere only the music could take her. In the audience, a woman in a red dress felt tears sliding down her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. A businessman who had been checking his email put down his phone and sat forward, his mouth slightly open. The man who had checked his watch now gripped the armrests of his seat, his knuckles white. Victoria emerged from behind her hands, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, she's incredible." The diamond woman had stopped recording. Her phone hung forgotten in her hand as she stared at the stage, unable to process what she was witnessing. Kevin smiled to himself. He had known. Somehow he had known. The music built toward the first movement's emotional peak. Sister Margaret's hands crashed down on the keys with surprising strength, drawing out the full power of the piano. The sound was enormous, filling every corner of the hall, vibrating in everyone's chest. Then it softened to something tender and heartbreaking, a gentle melody that sounded like a lullaby or a memory of something precious and lost. An elderly man in the front row wasn't just crying, he was weeping. His whole body shook with sobs that he tried to muffle with his hand. The woman next to him touched his shoulder gently, tears streaming down her own face. This wasn't just a performance. It was something sacred, something that reached into the deepest parts of each person listening and touched places they had forgotten existed. The music spoke of human experience, of suffering and transcendence, of the beauty that exists even in the midst of pain. Sister Margaret's hands raced through a technically demanding passage, notes cascading like water over rocks. Her fingers, old and worn from decades of manual labor, moved with the grace of a dancer. The arthritis, the stiffness, none of it seemed to matter. The music was stronger than any physical limitation. The piece moved into quieter territory, delicate and introspective. Sister Margaret barely touched the keys now, coaxing out sounds so soft that the audience held their breath to hear them. The silence between notes was as important as the notes themselves. Each pause weighted with meaning. Then the build began again. Slowly at first, then faster and more intense. The left hand provided a steady driving rhythm while the right hand wove intricate patterns above it. The two melodies intertwined, separated, came together again. It was like watching two dancers who knew each other so well they could anticipate every move. The woman who had smirked in the third row was now leaning forward, completely absorbed. Her earlier judgment had evaporated, replaced by awe. Around the hall, people sat transfixed, some with tears on their faces, others with their eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. A few with expressions of wonder, as if witnessing something they couldn't quite believe. In the back of the hall, a teenage boy who had been dragged to the event by his parents and had planned to be bored the whole time, found himself moved in a way he didn't understand. The music was speaking to him, telling him things he didn't have words for. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Sister Margaret played on, lost in the music, unaware of the effect she was having. The stage lights were hot on her face. Her hands were beginning to ache. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the music, the pure expression of something beautiful and true. The first movement was approaching its conclusion. The tempo increased. The dynamics grew. Sister Margaret's whole body moved with the effort now, the force required to draw such powerful sound from the piano. Her face showed the strain, but also something like joy. Pure, undiluted joy. And then with a final dramatic flourish, a cascade of notes that seemed to tumble over each other in their rush to be heard, she struck the final chord. The sound rang out, powerful and definitive, then slowly faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The silence was absolute, profound. Sister Margaret sat very still, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes still closed, letting the last vibrations die away. And then the hall erupted. The applause was like an explosion. 300 people leaped to their feet as one, clapping so hard their hands hurt, shouting and cheering. The sound was deafening. It bounced off the walls and ceiling, a wave of appreciation and astonishment that seemed like it would never end. Sister Margaret opened her eyes and blinked in surprise. She looked out at the standing ovation, at all these elegant people on their feet for her, and for a moment she seemed confused, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then, slowly she stood and offered a small, humble bow. The applause grew even louder. The applause continued, a thunderous wave that showed no signs of stopping. Sister Margaret stood beside the piano, her small frame almost overwhelmed by the magnitude of the response. She had expected maybe polite clapping, perhaps some appreciation for her effort. But this was something else entirely. People weren't just applauding. They were cheering, whistling, shouting words of praise. The woman in the red dress who had cried during the performance was now clapping so hard her hands were red. The businessman who had been on his phone was wiping his eyes with his sleeve, not caring who saw. Even the teenagers in the back, the ones who had looked bored when they arrived, were on their feet yelling, "Bravo!" Sister Margaret bowed again, deeper this time, and began to make her way off the stage. Her legs felt shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. Her hands were trembling. She had given everything she had to that performance, and the exhaustion was catching up with her. But the audience wouldn't let her leave. The applause grew even louder, and people began calling for her to come back. "More, more," someone shouted. Others took up the cry. The MC, who had been standing frozen in the wings, finally remembered his job and rushed out. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sister Margaret," he called into the microphone, gesturing for her to return to center stage. Sister Margaret paused at the edge of the curtain. She hadn't expected this. She had played her piece, done what she'd offered to do. But the audience was insistent, their enthusiasm building rather than fading. Slowly, she walked back out, and the cheering intensified. That's when something unexpected happened. From the front row, an elderly man stood up. He was distinguished-looking, with silver hair and a well-tailored suit. His face was wet with tears, and his hands were shaking as he began making his way toward the stage. Several people in the audience noticed him and whispered, pointing. He seemed to be someone important, though Sister Margaret didn't recognize him. The man climbed the steps to the stage with some difficulty, and the MC looked confused about whether to stop him or let him continue. But something about his demeanor, the emotion visible on his face, made everyone hold back. The applause died down to an uncertain murmur as the audience watched this unfold. The man approached Sister Margaret, and when he got close enough, his voice cracked with emotion. "Margaret Chen?" Sister Margaret's hand flew to her heart. That name. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 50 years. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She just stared at this man, trying to place the familiar features beneath the decades of aging. "Professor Harrison?" she finally whispered. The man nodded, tears streaming freely down his face now. He turned to address the audience, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, you need to know who you just heard perform. This woman, Sister Margaret, was once known as Margaret Chen, and she was quite possibly the most gifted pianist of her generation." A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Every eye was fixed on the stage. Professor Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. 53 years ago, Margaret won the International Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow. She was only 21 years old. I was her teacher at the conservatory, and I have never, in all my years of teaching, encountered a talent like hers. She was extraordinary. Offers came from everywhere. Concert halls around the world wanted to book her. Recording companies fought for her signature. She could have had anything she wanted. Sister Margaret stood very still, her eyes closed, as memories she had locked away came flooding back. The competition in Moscow, the standing ovations, the flash of cameras, the feeling that her whole life was opening up before her like a flower. She was engaged to be married. Professor Harrison continued, his voice breaking. To a wonderful young man named David. They were planning their future together. And then, 3 weeks before the wedding, there was an accident. The professor had to pause, overcome with emotion. Sister Margaret opened her eyes, and they were wet with tears. Some wounds, it seemed, never fully healed even after 5 decades. David was killed by a drunk driver, Professor Harrison said quietly. Margaret was devastated. We all were. But none of us understood the depth of her pain. 2 months later, she disappeared. No note, no explanation. She simply vanished. We searched for her, tried to find out what happened. For years, I wondered if she was even alive. He turned back to Sister Margaret, reaching out to take her hands in his. "And now I find you here, playing like you never stopped, playing like an angel." Sister Margaret squeezed his hands gently. "I needed to disappear, Professor. Every note I played reminded me of what I'd lost. David and I had planned everything together, every concert, every recording. Without him, the music became unbearable. So I gave it up and found a different way to live." "But you came back to it tonight," Professor Harrison said. "Why?" Sister Margaret looked out at the audience, at all those faces watching her with wonder and compassion. "Because people needed help. The shelters are counting on the money from tonight. And I realized that maybe my gift was never meant to be just for me. Maybe it was always meant to be for others." The professor smiled through his tears. "David would be proud of you, of the life you've lived, of the person you became." Sister Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she found her voice. "I'd like to think so. I'd like to think he'd understand that I had to step away for a while, but that the music never really left me. It just went quiet for a time." Victoria, the event coordinator, had made her way onto the stage as well. Her earlier skepticism completely evaporated. "Sister Margaret, I owe you an apology. I doubted you. I dismissed you. I'm so sorry. There's nothing to apologize for, Sister Margaret said kindly. You didn't know. How could you? The way we treated you, Victoria continued, shaking her head. We judged you by how you looked, by what we assumed about you. We almost didn't let you play. But you did let me play, Sister Margaret pointed out. That's what matters. You took a chance when it counted. The woman with the diamonds approached now too, looking thoroughly ashamed. I laughed at you. I actually laughed. I recorded you on my phone, planning to make fun of the situation. Instead, I captured one of the most beautiful performances I've ever witnessed. She held up her phone. Would you mind if I shared this? I think the world should see it. Sister Margaret hesitated, then smiled.
If it helps the shelters, then yes.
Share it. Professor Harrison addressed the audience again. I taught music for 45 years. I've trained concert pianists who perform at Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall. But I have never heard a performance with more soul, more truth, than what Sister Margaret gave us tonight. She reminded me why music matters. It's not about perfection or technique, though she has both in abundance. It's about touching the human heart. The audience erupted into applause again, and this time Sister Margaret let herself really feel it. She had spent so many years making herself small, invisible, serving others from the shadows. But tonight she had stepped into the light, and it felt right. Not because of the recognition or the praise, but because she had used her gift to help others. Kevin, the young sound technician who had believed in her from the start, was grinning from ear to ear in the wings. Robert, who had dismissed her so completely, looked like he'd been hit by a truck, his assumptions about the world thoroughly shattered. As the evening continued, people lined up to speak with Sister Margaret. They wanted to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her how the music had moved them. The teenage boy from the back row waited patiently in line, and when his turn came, he said simply, "That was the most amazing thing I've ever heard. You made me understand why my mom keeps trying to get me to practice piano." Sister Margaret laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Then practice, dear. You never know when you might need to use what you've learned." The charity gala ended up raising 3 times its original goal. The video that the Diamond Woman posted went viral, viewed millions of times within days. News outlets picked up the story of the elderly nun who had stunned a concert hall. Requests poured in for Sister Margaret to perform at other venues, but Sister Margaret declined most of them. She returned to St. Catherine's Convent the next morning, back to her simple life of prayer and service. The only change she made was agreeing to teach piano 3 afternoons a week at the community center, working with children who couldn't afford regular lessons. On her first day of teaching, a shy little girl with tangled hair asked, "Are you really famous?" Sister Margaret knelt down to the child's level. "I don't know about famous, but I do know that music is a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared. That's what I'm going to teach you. Not just how to play the piano, but how to use whatever gifts you have to make the world a little better." The little girl smiled and climbed onto the piano bench. And Sister Margaret, who had hidden her light for 53 years, finally understood that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not in hiding yourself away, but in letting your gifts shine no matter how long they've been dormant, no matter how unlikely the stage. The music she had learned was never really gone. It had just been waiting for the right moment to return, and when it did, it changed everything.